History of the Americas, Introduction. Throughout the Bible you read of nations rising and falling, wicked nations being punished and Israel being blessed when they had faith in God. You also read of human sacrifice, and one of the infamous people who performed human sacrifice to their god Baal was the Canaanites and other inhabitants of the land of Canaan. Even the Israelites did this wicked thing when they fell away from the one true God. Wicked people like those in the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed by God for their exceeding wickedness. The northern kingdom of Israel was conquered and they were sold into slavery for their wickedness of serving false gods. God, being king over all nations of the earth, did the same to the native inhabitants of the Americas. With mass sacrifice being common in the Aztec Empire and nature worship being common among many indigenous tribes all throughout the Americas, it is no shocker that God destroyed the peoples of the Americas and delivered the surviving remnant into the hands of foreign powers. Now I do not believe that the pagan Catholics were more righteous than the Aztecs. But God uses wicked nations to punish other wicked nations. For many people today this type of speech is extremely offensive, but as I stated before, God is sovereign over all nations and He is righteous to destroy them. Origins of Native and Indigenous Americans. According to secular history, the Native Americans crossed Byrrhenia about 13,000 years ago. They were of Asiatic descent. There is also a history presented by creationist Nathaniel Jensen, that the Americas were resettled at least once before and that the descendants of natives today replaced the original natives of the land. The Olmec civilization and many tribes making up the first wave, with the Mayans and Aztecs being those who replaced them. This timeline puts forth a recent, 1st century AD, resettling of the Americas. In the book of Genesis there was a worldwide famine, and because of Joseph Egypt had plenty of grain stored up. And all the world came to Egypt for food. This was in perhaps the 20th century BC, so in these times no one was in America. Unless they went over Byrrhenia and were still in contact with the known world. But this is highly unlikely. It was likely after the famine that people crossed the Bering Strait and settled the Americas. Byrrhenia was 1,000 miles wide and the peoples likely didn't notice that they were crossing a land bridge. They were just following the big game animals. Perhaps animals such as the holy mammoth, or the giant sloth, the great bison. Another thing to consider is that these people may have even lived on Byrrhenia considering its sheer size. There was also a variety of different predators, some of which were greater than the ones today. For example, the saber-toothed tiger, the short-faced bear which could run 30 miles an hour, the cave bear, dire wolves and dinosaurs or dragons. Most of these beasts went extinct because when an area is settled or civilized the predators are driven out or killed. I've heard strawman arguments such as because the Bible didn't mention the Native Americans it is not historically accurate, but this argument can be dismissed by the fact that when the Americas were colonized most of the original names of places were changed. Also, if you take into account the difference in language over time, especially of an orally passed down language, that original language can be unintelligible within 30 generations. Besides these evidences, those who crossed Byrrhenia likely did not cross it immediately after the Tower of Babel. As I've shown before, it likely happened at least 500 years after the flood. This means that those who passed Byrrhenia did not have the same names as those who are recorded in Genesis and the Book of Chronicles and were not mentioned in the biblical genealogies. There are also many peoples who were not mentioned in the biblical genealogies. For example, the Togolese people were not mentioned in the Bible, but the ancestor they descended from was mentioned. The Bible was never supposed to be seen as a book that tracked and recorded every family, tribe and civilization. It gives you the names of the 3 sons of Noah which all the world came from and lists some of their descendants. The root, the base and sometimes the branches and leaves. So, who did the natives come from? The civilizations of Mesoamerica and some of South America carried on traditions and customs of other civilizations in the Old World. First of all, The pyramids that the Mayans and Aztecs built are very similar pyramids in Cambodia, China and all throughout the Old World. There is also a pyramid underwater off the coast of a Japanese island. These pyramids are likely imitations of the original Egyptian pyramids and Mesopotamian ziggurats. Pyramids were usually built as tombs for a king who was seen as God in the form of man on earth. In Asian and Mesoamerica, pyramids were often altars for human sacrifice. But regardless of their use, it is not common for two worlds isolated for so-called 13,000 years to have the same types of structures. The mainstream history of the Native Americans makes zero sense. For if they arrived on the continent 13,000 years ago, why did they build pyramids which were obviously influenced by pyramids in the Old World? What presumably happened is, after the original pyramids and structures were built in the Middle East, other civilizations built imitation structures in their lands. And then other civilizations imitated those imitations. Cambodia seems very promising in answering where the Mayans and possibly Aztecs came from. The Siam Reap Pyramid in Cambodia and the Temple of the Great Jaguar in Guatemala are two structures that look very similar. Mayan pyramids look like a hybrid between the Prang Temple in Cambodian, the Pyramid of Giza and several ziggurats in Iraq. While the Pyramid of the Sun, which is of unknown origin, resembles the Qinshi Mausoleum in Xi'an, China. These similarities give proof to a more modern migration rather than a prehistoric migration. Some claim that the Olmecs were of African descent. The main evidence for their African descent is that their writing system is similar to West African writing. There are also rituals and religious customs which can be traced back to the ancient Near East, customs such as bloodletting, done as a blood offering to the false gods. In Canaan, ancient prophets of Baal also did this. One custom found both in the Old World and the New World is the elongation of the head. The Mayans, ancient Peruvians, Mangbutu people of Central Africa, and ancient Chinese all practiced this custom. Thank you for watching, and make sure to stay tuned in for my upcoming 4-part series on the history of the Americas.